Hello, everyone. I think I have it on. Thanks for being here. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which sit on the ancestral lands of the Choctaw prior to their forced removal. If you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. The new Green Book exhibit is open upstairs, started in 1936 and published annually through, any guesses? What was the last year the Green Book was published? 1967. The Green Book Guide helped African Americans travel the country safely during the Jim Crow era. If you haven't yet seen the exhibit, drop by our History Happy Hour on Tuesday, July 19th from 5 to 7 p.m. Museum staff will lead flash tours of the exhibit, as well as through these museums, where they'll highlight stories about travel and transportation. The free program offers complimentary hors d'oeuvres and a cash bar. It's a new era at the Department of Archives and History, fellows. Next week's History is Lunch will differ from our usual format. We've talked about the department's partnership this year with the Mississippi Museum of Art to focus on the Great Migration. One component of that is a workshop here in Jackson for teachers from Mississippi and Louisiana, but also from as far away as Michigan and Illinois. It made sense to have the keynote address to that group also be a History is Lunch program, and so we'll be joined next Wednesday remotely by the Chicago poet and author Eve Ewing, and she'll be in discussion with Ebony Lumumba, who will be here on site with us. So that should be a really great program, and hope that you will all make it back for that. Today, we are delighted to have our friend Stephanie Rolph with us to discuss the new University Press of Mississippi reissue of Hodding Carter's 1959 book, The South Strikes Back. Stephanie Rolph is Associate Professor of History at Millsaps College. She earned her BA in History from Millsaps and her MA and PhD in U.S. History from Mississippi State University. Rolph is the immediate past president of the Mississippi Historical Society and author of Resisting Equality, the Citizens Council, 1954 to 1989. Help me welcome Stephanie Rolph.
Thanks, Chris. Now, those of you who know me know how much fun this is for me to come back. I love this place. I love the people at this place. And so many of the archivists and the administrators and the leaders of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History keep me going and encourage me to keep doing this work in Mississippi. It matters that we're here. It matters that we're looking at our history so closely. Chris mentioned that I just rolled off being president of the Mississippi Historical Society Board, and we had our first in-person meeting just a few months ago in the midst of, after having some remote meetings because of COVID. And I just can't tell you how meaningful this historical community has been to so many of us. I think Mississippi benefits quite a lot from having this nice balance and combination of professional scholars and people who are interested and passionate about history, as well as our archivists and public historians who are doing work across the state. And so whenever I have the opportunity and privilege to be here or to have a platform, I always want to champion that and to think about, I don't know that we always remember this, or realize this in the larger context of departments of archives and history across the country. This state is a leader. The space that we're in right now is a product of the beneficial relationships that our leaders at MDH have been able to establish and maintain with our state legislators, and having a space where we can come look at our history closely over and over and over again. I'm actually going to be bringing a group of students here on Sunday to kind of wander around and get a sense of the place that they're going to be spending the next 4 years of their life in. So this space is really meaningful to me for a lot of reasons. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. some of you, the last time I was up here, Chris and I were talking about this a minute ago. I was presenting on my first book, Resisting Equality, which is a comprehensive history of the Citizens Council. And coming into this project, just to set the context for you a little bit, this is intimidating for me. Hodding Carter III wrote about the council in 1959 as it was happening in real time. And he risked quite a bit when he did that. And so when Trent Brown reached out to me, the editor of this Civil Rights in Mississippi series that University Press of Mississippi has created, I was hesitant to do it because I was so close to the subject, having just finished Resisting Equality. And so I'm using that a little bit as a caveat to say I have an enormous amount of respect for Hodding Carter III, for the work of his father, for the ongoing work that Carter did throughout his career. And so while some of the foreword in the South Strikes Back re-release comes off as a critique, please know that the contribution that he made in 1959, and I hope my remarks reflect this throughout, was pretty incredible. And there's a lot of complexity in the South Strikes Back that at first glance you might not see. And so really what I'm going to focus on today and really profiling the South Strikes Back and what its contribution meant is sort of in looking at the role of the white moderate, and to really dig down into that quite a bit as we think about resistance to civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s. So, when I got into the Citizens Council project for the first book, one of the things, and many of you have heard me say this a lot, but one of the things that was really troubling me was, how do you look at this group of guys who people perceived as being so incredibly powerful and influential? How do you deal with them in retrospect and kind of recognize that the resources and the manpower and the woman power that went into resisting civil rights reform in a place like Mississippi and really throughout the South, how do you make sense of that huge investment knowing that landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, fair housing in 1968, and so on, followed? And that, I didn't realize when I first got into the project that the Citizens Council didn't officially disband until 1989. So when I got into that project, I was really curious about what they were doing that whole time. And I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of journalists and media folks and even elected officials who were wondering where the money was going and what they were doing with it. So getting into that, and trying to account for these different pieces of the council's work was what led me through the first project. And I'm not going to talk about that today. You should buy the book. But when Carter was writing in 1958 and 1959, the book was published in 1959, his position was very different than mine. And I kind of want to leave that as a hanging question for everybody because, the work of journalists and the work of historians is different work, but in many ways it's codependent. So I used Carter's work for resisting equality. I used his father's work for resisting equality. But he's writing this in 1958 as the council's ascendancy is still happening. So the council has not hit its peak in Mississippi by 1959, but it's about to. Who was elected to governor in 1959? We have a big body of water that's named after him. Ross Barnett is elected in 1959. He's a huge fan of the Citizens Council. So once he's elected, there's this period of time where you cannot stop the council. They are taking over. And they have infiltrated the political system in the state. So Carter is not privy to that. He is watching that campaign happen, but he doesn't know how it's going to turn out. And I think maybe, I shouldn't speak for him. I think lots of people were surprised that Ross Barnett won that election. He was not the lead candidate at the beginning, but there was a certain atmosphere in Mississippi that created a lot of fear, and Barnett seemed to win over those votes. So getting into this project was intimidating for me, knowing that this was someone who was so close to it, which as historians, we're trained to do the opposite of that, to kind of get some distance from our subjects. This is one of the reasons that we wait about a generation before we write about a topic, so that we can have some objectivity. And so I wasn't really sure how to write the foreword. It was difficult for me. So if you find that the quality is not that great, let's look at that as my humility. Can we give that to me? And so I really just kind of I want to caveat all of that sort of around, my personal entry into this work. I have so much admiration for this contribution in 1959. For those of you who remember the Citizens Council, this was not an atmosphere where you challenged their influence without retribution. And so as we kind of go through some of the pieces of this, I hope you will keep in mind that, there's a larger question at hand here, and that is, I was doing this interview with MPB yesterday that I think that aired today. I haven't heard it. But Desiree Frazier was asking me, as journalists often do, this is the bane of our existence in some ways as historians, well, what about the present moment that we're in? Like, how resonant is this? So this is a difficult question for us as historians that we kind of try to not necessarily avoid, but we probably over-explain a little bit. I want us all to kind of collectively think about Carter's work, his contributions, his study of the white moderates, and to actually think about how this might guide us a little bit in the way that we engage in conversations. It probably doesn't need to be said that we're incredibly polarized right now. We're all quite ambivalent, I think, about what direction is the right direction. And so I am going to, do something that I wouldn't do in front of my students and say, please engage that question. I don't see any point of being up here unless we're experiencing the environment that we're in and trying to figure out how Carter handled it, what worked, what didn't work, and what the council can kind of teach us about, some of the resistance that we're seeing today. So I want to start with a critique of The South Strikes Back. This was from William Peters, who was writing a review of The South Strikes Back in 1959 for the New York Times. He called Carter's work a failed, quote, attempt to remain entirely above the battle, a striving for objectivity resulting in some remarkably naive statements. So, full disclosure, Peters had done his own work on the council. He was writing as, if I may say, as an outsider to Mississippi, as many journalists were at the time. After Emmett Till's murder in 1955, the national press really sort of drove into Mississippi and wanted to know more about this place. How could something like this happen? And so, since Carter himself was a native of Mississippi, and I'll do a little bio on him in just a second, because he was from Mississippi and had grown up in Mississippi, was working in Mississippi at the time that the book was written, Peter saw him as provincial. Carter was not provincial, but he saw him as too close to his subject, that he was making excuses and apologies for the council, an organization that had created an atmosphere of fear, that had stifled civil rights demonstrations, organizations, progress, and had silenced any resistance to their work. And so Peter's work in this quote, I think, on the surface, you might get into The South Strikes Back, and I hope you will pick up a copy on your way out. He's writing at a time where he's very young. He's just returned home, and he's walked back into an environment that is unrecognizable to him. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but this is part of what motivated Carter to write the book in the first place. He wasn't fully on board with the way that the national press was writing about Mississippi. He wasn't in full disagreement with it, and he is a critic of Mississippi. But he also feels like the national press is too quick to kind of throw Mississippi into this benighted bucket. You know, this idea that anything could happen here. They are uneducated, they're terrorists, there's no hope for them except for federal force. And so, you know, Carter, I mean, you would have to read Carter's book 2 or 3 times, I think, to pick up on all of the nuances of that, but because he is a segregationist as well. And so there's a lot of complications as we look at Carter, we look at his father, and we look at the white moderates in this particular period of time. So this is the critique that the book initially got, and I think that you certainly could see that in retrospect. As a historian of the council, I can tell you there was a lot that Carter didn't get about the council, but it's 1959. So just to catch everybody up, if you're not familiar with the Citizens Council, and I never assume that is the case, the council was an organization that was founded in Indianola, Mississippi, 2 months after the Brown versus Board of Education decision was announced from the Supreme Court. And the Brown decision, as you likely know, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and said that separate facilities were inherently unequal. And essentially started this process towards desegregating public schools in the South. So the council was founded in order to obstruct implementation of Brown in 1954. And it was founded at the local level, and there's this brief period of time. The council becomes really well known really quickly. But there's a brief period of time in 1954 where the council sees itself as sort of a secret organization. So in early communications, letters and that sort of thing, in those first few months of the founding, the idea was that you would have these white guys who were already in positions of power in their local communities kind of band together and watch what was going on. And so the best example that I have of that, of how this starts, is that, you know, the NAACP was pretty vibrant in the 1940s in Mississippi. And so that organizational structure is already in place when Brown versus Board of Education is announced. So the next logical step for those NAACP chapters in places like Vicksburg, for example, or Yazoo City, is to pull together a school desegregation petition, to petition their local school districts to begin the desegregation process so black children can enroll in what had previously been white public schools, which were the superior schools. Much more money was being invested in, you know, white public schools, and they were, the schools themselves were unequal. So what a Citizens Council chapter could do is they could use that white leadership as a way to scrutinize those petitions, get the names and addresses of the people, find out who they were employed by, and then basically intimidate them until they removed their names from the petitions. Medgar Evers talks about this as early as 1955, basically saying that once vibrant chapters of the NAACP throughout the state, the example I'm thinking about right now is Yazoo City, were almost completely defunct within a year of council formation. So the council, you know, didn't necessarily have to be a visible organization for its tactics to work really well. It leverages the structure that they already have access to. So when we talk about, and I hesitate to even say this, but I am trying to sort of make some connections into how we're still sort of wrestling with these issues today. When we talk about things like structural racism, or we talk about systemic racism, this power structure is that, okay? It is the people who have power to make bank loans. It is the people who are elected to public office. It is the county sheriff. It is the mayor. It is attorneys. It's the district attorney. It's the judge that's sitting behind the bench. It is the white guys who are in power who are becoming members of the council. And I just don't want that point to be missed because they are already in a position to make authoritative decisions without being questioned. And so, this is something that is inherited over generations, even as we do see progress in civil rights reform and things like that. So Carter's work is really, so we often think of the Citizens Council as slowing down civil rights organization in the state and throughout the South. That's absolutely true. I just mentioned Medgar Evers' impression of the council and the work that it was able to accomplish. The Citizens Council is able to delay more visible civil rights organization in a way that other states can't. So in Mississippi, it takes a little while for it to get up and going. But what Carter's book focuses on is the silencing of white moderates. And this is something that I want to give full attention and legitimacy to. And for people in the room who remember the council, whenever I talk about the council one-on-one with folks, I'm thinking about my former professor at Millsaps, Dr. Charles Salas, who I hope is watching today with Harlan. When we were first talking about this project before the book was done and we were sort of thinking through some of these things, he was really, he was really talking to me about, it's easy as a historian, I think, to kind of look back at how people feel and really not let it resonate with you too deeply. But Dr. Salas, has told me a couple of times that, folks at Millsaps knew about the council. They were scared of the council. They acted accordingly. And the white moderate in particular for Carter was the most harmed by the council. So I say that with all due respect to that position, and I want us to give legitimacy to that position. He was a white moderate. His father was a white moderate. In the 1930s and 40s, if you've ever looked at archival materials or you've heard people talk about the 30s and 40s, you'll see white moderates referred to more popularly as the Southern liberal. Okay, so those terms are kind of interchangeable for me. But by the time Carter's writing, and the way that I write about these people is I use that term moderate. I think that is more accurate for the period of time that I'm looking at. And so he saw their impact as being much more worrisome as it impacted white moderates. And I'll tell you a little bit why that's the case. So Carter, if you're not familiar with Carter, his father is Hodding Carter Jr., and when I was doing research on the first book, I had to always be really meticulous about who we were talking about, whether it was junior or third, and to try to make sure that I would check and double check and check for a third time to make sure. But he was born in 1935. Carter III was born in 1935 in New Orleans. And then his family moved into Greenville, which is where Hodding Carter Jr. spent his career as editor of the Delta Democrat Times. And Carter Jr. he won a Pulitzer in 1946 for some of the journalism that he had done related to Bilbo, and he had been doing this work for a long time. So if you know this term of Southern progressives or Southern liberals, what I call white moderates, this is usually comes in the form of journalists, but also you see it in some business communities and you see it in some Southern faculty members at places like UNC Chapel Hill. They write quite a bit about the progress that the South needs to continue to make. They worry a lot about the lynching epidemic that you see in the 1890s and that sort of pops up again. And so, Carter's father, Hodding Carter Jr., wrote a lot about the atmosphere of violence that a place like Mississippi was cultivating, that there wasn't enough racial progress. Now, his father, and from what I can tell, Carter III were both segregationists. And they are of the ilk of someone like Governor J.P. Coleman, who is governor when The South Strikes Back is published. J.P. Coleman is from Ackerman, Mississippi. He is sort of labeled by Earl Johnston, who later will become head of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, as a practical segregationist. And what that means is he was not a member of the Citizens Council, but he was very much supportive of this idea of using legal means to delay and hopefully permanently resist desegregation. So J.P. Coleman was elected in 1954, and Ross Barnett is the governor that follows him. J.P. Coleman hates the Citizens Council. J.P. Coleman is governor when the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission is founded. And so when we're talking about white moderates, Coleman fits into that as well as Carter. And part of Carter Jr.'s work for the Delta Democrat Times out of Greenville was in trying to expose some of this and to appeal to the better angels of white Southerners' nature. That we know that this is tradition and we believe in the system of segregation. However, segregation doesn't need to imply violence. And so they're drawing this line that gets lost as soon as the council makes an appearance and sort of shuts down that kind of nuance. And so when Hodding Carter III returns to Mississippi in 1957, the council has been active for about 3 years. And the level of discourse that Carter III was used to, from his father's example, from the articles that had been written, from the environment that he had grown up in, is pretty shocking to him. So when I got into rereading The South Strikes Back, that was something that I was kind of trying to keep at the front of my mind, was that this is personal for Carter. So Peter's critique of him is spot on. I don't think that Carter III ever pretended that it wasn't personal for him. And in later writings, when he talks about his father, and this is in the 80s when Carter III is writing about his father, one of the things that he says, and I think this is something that we should be kind of sobered up by, is that nobody was really in his house and seeing the level of fear that his father experienced from writing these articles. That we could look back in the 21st century and say, well, he didn't go far enough. He was a segregationist. And listen, I have to check myself on that. And I think this project was pretty humbling for me in that way, is to recognize that perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of the good, right? And that maybe some of that has gotten lost in our own discourse. And Carter, Carter Jr. was himself quite outspoken in a way that nobody else was at the time. Was he an integrationist? Was he a fan of the NAACP? Absolutely not. Was he resentful of that at times? Absolutely. And so was Hodding Carter III. Hodding Carter III was not a fan of the NAACP. He felt like civil rights demonstrations were making the problem worse. And so I'm trying to hold all of that together here, because I do think that there is a personal lesson that we all need to be learning right now about how to deal with complexity. So, when I talk to my students about Thomas Jefferson, for example, I'm trying to get them to kind of hold the complexity of this man, and his entire personal life and his entire contribution to the nation, and to understand that it is not an either or, that it is all of it, and that's human nature. And so when he comes back in 1957, he comes back to assist with the editorialship of the Delta Democrat Times. And there were lots of people beginning to comment on the fact that Carter Jr. was beginning to experience a fair amount of mental mental consequence from the level of stress that was being created. I will say in 1955, Hodding Carter Jr. wrote a couple of articles about the Citizens Council for Look magazine. Look magazine also incidentally happened to be the publication that interviewed Emmett Till's murderers, who confessed there and all of that. And so this is a heavily circulated publication at the time. And I used Carter Jr.'s work quite a bit in resisting equality to get a sense of just how pervasive the council's influence was. And so what is happening in Mississippi in 1959 when this book is published is also something that I want to talk just a bit about. So I mentioned that the first council chapter is founded in Indianola in 1954, July. Just a few months later, a statewide association is founded. So there's this period of time from July to December where there are chapters popping up everywhere. Some of them are county-based, some of them are city-based. The Jackson Citizens Council is probably the most persistent over time, so it's the one that continues to be active in the 1970s, while most of the other ones are going to shut down and become inactive. But that state organization is founded to help organize the vote that the referendum that Mississippi voters vote on to say that they're willing to close the public schools if they are forced to desegregate them. This is the council's first success, is in organizing that vote, and they use their state association to do that. By 1955, so less than a year later, you have a series of murders of 2 active civil rights activists and 1 14-year-old boy from Chicago. You're familiar with that story, I hope, and it has recently been in the news because of this discovered warrant that seems to have never been issued. The Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission has formed by 1956, and I always just take a second to differentiate the council from the Sovereignty Commission. They were not friends, they were rivals. And the founding of the Sovereignty Commission, which does its own damage, for sure, happens under J.P. Coleman's administration because he wants to create a state agency that can do similar work as the council's doing, but without having to deal with the council. He sees them as tyrants, essentially, and he wants to sort of sanction it through a state agency. So when the Sovereignty Commission is first founded, we know them best as a surveillance agency and all of the investigations that they're doing across the state. But when it's first founded, it's a public relations agency. Most of the work that they're doing is dedicated to sending white Southern speakers out of the state to win over the sympathies of white Northerners and people on the West Coast and tap into what they see as a conservative sentiment that might help win support for segregation. And so the Sovereignty Commission is formed in 1956, and in a few years it will shift more into the surveillance space. But initially they're dedicated to the public relations piece of this. It becomes immediately clear to the Citizens Council that this is meant to be a competitor of sorts. So the Citizens Councils of America will form that same year. This becomes the part of the organization that is probably most comprehensive and will persist into the 1980s. That's where most of my material comes from, is from the CCA. And so they get into a lot of different stuff. But the gubernatorial election year in 1959 is what Carter is watching unfold as he's writing this book. And he sees this as, sort of a critical achievement of the book, is to kind of get the attention of his audience here. So there are what I see, and I definitely want to leave some time for discussion. When he writes this book, this is sort of the centralizing statement that I think helps get us as close to Carter as possible when we think about his motivation for writing. He's risking a lot by doing it, in 1959 especially. So he states towards the end of the first chapter, The fact remains that in the South, the Citizens Council takes and merits most of the credit for whatever success massive resistance, with all its implications, has had. And there is little or no disposition by anyone, politician or not, to argue the point. So at the very beginning of the book, Carter says, this atmosphere that we're experiencing right now is the product of the council. He's writing it at a time when the council has picked its candidate for governor. They do not formally endorse Ross Barnett, but Ross Barnett has been a member of the council since its founding. He actually canvasses neighborhoods and does polls with people prior to running for governor, where he's trying to organize neighborhoods into council membership. And so there was no question about whether or not he was going to be supportive of the council. And the council's looking for state money. They want state money to be funded into their projects. And so this is all to the good for them. So he makes it clear in the very beginning of the book that the council is the problem here. And he sort of makes his way through a few different points about that. There's a fair amount of ambivalence that Carter has about the council's role, whether it's all good or all bad. But I see Carter fighting a few battles in this book. And you know, there's much more to this than just kind of listing these off. But Carter is grieving the silencing of the white moderate. He talks quite a bit about this in the opening chapter. He actually gives a history lesson to his readers about the fact that the Southern liberal, as he first calls them, that the Southern liberal, the group of which his father was a vibrant part, had done a lot for the South. They had spoken out against outdated racial norms. They had spoken out against violence. They had advocated for better education, for more modern economies, for more democratic involvement from citizens to elect progressive leaders. And he kind of takes the reader through the history of the Southern white liberal and what will become the white moderate. And he talks about this as sort of a linear progression over time. He's probably romanticizing it a little bit. This is the household that he grew up in. But historically, this bears out quite a bit. There is a lot of progress. There is a lot of outspoken proponents of progress throughout the South in places like Mississippi. So when he talks about the council and he sort of tracks its movement and its growth over time, throughout the book, he's grieving the silencing of white moderates. So he feels like something has been done to that voice, the practical voice that maybe understands there's this legal mandate that we're supposed to be following, and we don't want to do it, but we have to find the right way to do it, maybe without being too polarizing. He feels like the council's presence has silenced them. In a similar vein, he feels like white moderates have broken his heart a little bit, that they have been too easily silenced, that they are silent in their own space, that they're not pushing back. So one example I'll use from my own institution, because I think this is fair. My provost is in the room right now, the chair of my department, and the dean of my division is here. Millsaps had this reputation of being kind of a progressive institution, and in fact it was. There were quite a bit of collaborations between Tougaloo College and Millsaps College throughout the 1940s. And there had been really no pushback about that. Nobody was, it wasn't kept secret. It's just that it wasn't under scrutiny. When the council appears in 1954 and its influence spreads, Millsaps becomes an easy target. And there are council members who are sending their kids to Millsaps. And so the Citizens Council uses Millsaps as an example of what can happen to you if you do not pull back. So they expose and start writing articles in the Clarion Ledger and the Jackson Daily News about Millsaps being anti-segregation. Millsaps wasn't. There were people at Millsaps who were. The institution was probably more on the practical segregationist side at that point. And President Finger's first response to that is, we are not pro-segregation. We've been doing these collaborations for years. It's not a big deal. But the council keeps pressing and pressing and pressing. Parents start removing their students. And Millsaps starts to feel like they may have to shut down. And so he uses that example in The South Strikes Back to talk about how even a vibrant, well-respected, progressive institution that's full of people, okay, we're not just talking about one person or three people or a small office somewhere, but an entire college could feel this influence like a black cloud over it. And in fact, what President Finger ends up doing is just making a very explicit statement that we are not in favor of integration, nor would we ever be. And so there's this period of time, I think, where Millsaps is sort of moving it in more of a practical way, but the council shuts it down, and then those collaborations with Tougaloo College immediately end. And so he's really grieving that, and I think it shows up throughout the book. He talks a lot and insinuates a lot about how without that moderate voice, there's no telling where we're going to end up. And so I would go as far as to say that Carter believes that the white moderate is the answer, that they will be the saviors. But if they are being silenced and they're not fighting against that, the council element will take over. He's also fighting this battle that I mentioned before, and that is national press coverage of Mississippi and the civil rights movement. He doesn't like the way Mississippi's being portrayed. He doesn't appreciate what he considers to be sort of an oversimplified version of white Mississippi in response to Brown versus Board of Education. So what you'll find in the book are places where he's almost over-explaining the segregationist position. You know, like, we're not bad people. We just believe that this is the right thing for everyone. So that's the practical segregationist position for sure. And so he's offering this as a counter to national press coverage, if that makes sense. He's also offering this book as a way, there's an entire chapter about black activists in the state, and really probably more accurately, it's black Mississippians. And so in that chapter, Carter really articulates that, you know, this is a position that the council holds as well, that black Mississippians actually aren't that unhappy. If you spent some time down here, the system of segregation works. We need to better fund the school so that we have true equality. There are some bad elements in the state that are not representative of most of us. They're the ones responsible for the violence. And then he does this weird thing where he says, again, this is ambivalence on his part. I think he's trying to figure it out. He says the council is actually successful in staving off the reformation of the Klan. So he actually says that. And this is something that the council says a lot. If you don't want the Klan to come roaring back, become a member of the Citizens Council. Because we're the good guys. We're the white-collar guys. We're not the white hood guys. And so they use that as a way to generate membership because it could be worse. Carter seems to agree with that. He has vague memories of a Klan presence, or at least stories about the Klan's presence. The Klan is not active again in Mississippi until about 1964. As the council's losing power, I'm not going to say that the two things aren't related, but Carter does believe that the council is a moderating force, even as he's wrestling with their silencing of white moderates. So I do want you to go into this book understanding that there's some nuance in here that you're going to have to engage. He himself, I think, is unsure. He's pretty young when he writes this. I think he's 26. I was over 40 when my first book came out, so, I mean, who am I to criticize? I think there's also an element of the unknown that Carter is trying to wrestle with. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know if it's going to get better or worse. It gets worse, right? So this is 1959. There's a lot to come. The Freedom Rides happened in 1961, desegregation of Ole Miss, 1962. 1963 is full of activism, especially in Jackson. The Woolworth counter sit-ins happened then, the Jackson campaign. Medgar Evers is assassinated. John F. Kennedy is assassinated. It goes on and on and on. And so when he's writing this, I want to say that he is psychic, but I think there's an urgency to what Carter is presenting in The South Strikes Back that to me points to we have not bottomed out yet. He sees the council as largely responsible. I showed you that quote just a minute ago. He thinks the council's presence is responsible for the deterioration of the atmosphere. But he's also not sure that its removal is the right thing either. And, you know, I didn't live through this. And I can't really weigh in on this, not in good conscience. But we live through our own ambivalence right now, as I mentioned at the beginning. And I don't have a great statement to make here, except to say that he's limited in what he can do, to what he can say. I think that his contribution is brave and it's critical. But Ross Barnett is elected in 1959. The council does receive state funding, and it continues to grow and expand for another 10 years. So what he's seen in 1959 is this overwhelming influence. It becomes even bigger. And so I just want to finish with this quote that he has at the end of the book. In 1959, he's seeing the council sort of shifting into this direction of saying, you know, we are segregationists, but actually we're conservatives. So they're starting to pick up on that political language a little bit and say this is what connects us to the rest of the nation. So this is what he says. This is at the end of the book, and he's responding to that claim. Despite the obvious desire of the council's state leaders to make the Citizens Council into something more broadly based nationally than merely a pro-segregation movement, and despite the attraction such efforts have had for some of the council members in Mississippi, the fact still remains that the majority of the council's members belong to it not because of its, quote, respectability or its conservative credo, but because it serves as an organized channel for their deep desire and intention to maintain segregation and to freeze the Negro in his present status in Mississippi. All oratory aside, this is the basic drive behind the Citizens Council of Mississippi and throughout the South. And in that respect, he is spot on. The council never shifts its language enough for us to pay attention to. It is always focused on maintaining white supremacy, not just through the system of segregation, but across the world. And so Carter sort of reflects at the end of the book that he doesn't know that the council is going to last that much longer. He's really wrong about that, and he's really wrong about the fact that the council's message will not resonate outside of the South. And that is what we should care about, because the council's work across the country is going to impact presidential elections. It is going to impact the Southern white shift into the Republican Party. It is going to help partner with white minority regimes in Southern Africa. It's going to send funding to war efforts there. And so what he could not have seen in 1959 was that this was in no way a provincial organization, and that white moderates would eventually resurface by the time you get to 1963, 1964 with Paul Johnson's election, but that the imprint that the council leaves is something that still very much resonates with us today. It resets the rhetoric in a way that has been deeply impactful across a lot of spaces here. So we probably have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm happy to hear stories, reflections, critiques, but be nice. It's the middle of the week. I still have a couple more days ahead of me. But I really appreciate your attention, and I really am sort of fascinated by this topic.
Your scholarship and attention to detail continues to amaze me.
Thank you.
And the fact that you, a Southern white woman, can stand up and speak the truth so clearly is a testament to your courage, and I appreciate it. Would you accept the statement that the white moderate continues to take safe haven in the complexity of America and the South that continues to devalue and dehumanize the black man because it's economically advantageous? We look at the secession documents of the Southern states. Some people will say it was about economics. Well, yes, it was about the right to keep people slaves so Cotton could continue to become king, to reign as king. 1890, 1954, 1968 echoes today. We don't have a white citizens council. We don't have a Klan by those names in the paper, but those hate organizations continue to exist. And they are focused on African people, and then you just come back from the color line and get Hispanics and Arabs and move forward. Would you accept the statement that nothing will change until the white moderate recognizes the humanity of the black person?
Thank you, Deirdre. I mean, I think that I would go one step backward from that and say, I think what we need first is for the white moderate to recognize that they're not already there. Because I think this is the hardest part of the conversation, is speaking honestly and bravely about our own prejudices, about our own shortcomings, about our own limited experiences. And I think there are a lot of white moderates, I know there certainly are a lot of white liberals, who believe they're already there. And so if you try to engage that and say, actually, here's this thing that you just said or did, or that maybe you don't understand, then the defenses go up, right? And we start talking about things like white guilt, and we talk about white fragility and things like that. And so I do think, though, that the white moderate, politically speaking, is really tricky, because the white moderate is someone that we have really recently, over the past 4 to 6 years, see go completely to the right. And this is very similar to what happens in 1955, 56, 57, is that people who had really actually been quite moderate. George Wallace is one of those guys. Orville Faubus is one of those guys. They were practical segregationists. And they go to the right because of votes, popularity, opportunity, things like that. And so I think the white moderate is maybe, in some ways too movable as well. So I think that there is some own personal work that all of us as white people have to do. I think there's also this sense that many white moderates are too easily swayed into whatever the political trend of the day is.
My name is Avery Rollins. I know many of you in here. I worked as an FBI agent in the Greenville office from 1977 to 1984, and I have a perspective on the Carters. In that time, I worked from Greenville to Clarksdale to Carrollton to Myersville. And I found the city of Greenville to be the most moderate city anywhere in the Delta. And I attribute that to the Carters, Carter Jr. and Carter III. When other Mississippi cities were bragging about hiring the first African-American police officer, Greenville was already celebrating the retirement of their African-American police officers who had put in 20 to 25 years. And this is, as I said, between 1977 and 1984.
Thanks, Avery. I think that's something that again, when we remember resistance to the civil rights movement, we forget that there was there were those cases really across the state.
Two quick related questions. In the late 50s, there certainly was already a subtext on voter registration. Mm-hmm. What, if anything, did Hodding Carter III say about allowing Black people to vote? And in that regard, the murder of Reverend Lee, who was advocating for voter registration, whether he commented on that aspect of that murder?
He does comment about that, and he does speak specifically about Reverend Lee. Carter doesn't, I want to say this correctly. Carter does what a lot of white folks are doing during this period of time, including the Citizens Council, in that he sees the atmosphere as a white problem. He almost doesn't recognize organized demonstrations, that there's a whole campaigns that are going on that are local to the communities where they're happening. So he will say something about it and he'll recognize Lee's murder, but he doesn't talk in depth about the work that Lee is doing. He talks about the civil rights movement in Mississippi, but he also is not sure that that's not the product of outside agitators. He does talk about the legitimacy of voting rights for Black Mississippians, but he sees this as a product of gradualism, that if they're better educated and better situated economically, their time will come. And so I think all of that is very much in line with what most white moderates would have said at the time. It is a wait and see attitude for sure, and they're almost willfully blind. I shouldn't say almost. They just don't recognize the legitimacy of the Black liberation movements that are happening across the country and across the world. They are really obsessed with each other. They're obsessed with white unity. They're obsessed with all getting on the same page as white people.
Yes, good job, Stephanie. I was born in Jackson in 1954, year of Brown versus Board, and as my parents always called it, the White Citizens Council, and I stayed through Jackson Public Schools until I graduated from Murray in 72 and was zoned around and had Charles Salas at, and my parents always referred to it as the White Citizens Council. And I didn't know if the white part was just how much they abhorred what it stood for, or was it officially called the White Citizens Council at some time, and then they were forced to drop the white or decided it wasn't the best political term. Do you know anything about that history?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. So the council actually laughs at, when it's being referenced as the White Citizens Council, there's actually a forum broadcast where William Simmons talks about this, sort of laughing it off, that they call us the White Citizens Council. So that's never their formal name. They are always the Jackson Citizens Council, or it's the Association of Citizens Councils of Mississippi, or the Citizens Councils of America. So white is never officially part of their name. I think where that comes from, this is just from I read a ton of journalist sources when I'm looking at my stuff, and it seems that journalists pick up on that. And I think one of the reasons is because Citizens Council is such an innocuous term that it just seems like a civic organization, right? And that's how they describe themselves, that we're a civic organization that's looking out for our community. And so they think it's funny that they're referred to as White Citizens Council. I don't mind if people call them that. I don't refer to them that way, just to be historically accurate. Their material never includes white. You know, there's a foreign broadcast where Bill Simmons is talking about Council School 3, and he's talking about naming the segregationist academies, and he wants to make them sound sort of sophisticated. That's his explanation. But it's on Manhattan in Jackson, Manhattan Road. And so I guess, that he thought that was killing two birds with one stone.
I am impressed with the fact that young Hodding, as he was known in Greenville, was so young when he published this book. He graduated from college in 1957 and came back to Greenville after leaving college. He was a very young man to be putting forth this kind of, piece. Mm-hmm. And there were similar moderates in the city of Greenville. The most prominent, I would think, would be Ellen Douglas, the novelist of about the same age.
I think it reminds us that when he's speaking, when he's fighting this battle in The South Strikes Back, he's talking about people he knows, loves, and admires. Friends, his parents, the people he went to church with. And so it is a personal contribution just as much as it is a historical one.
Thank you all. I know that there are more questions than we have time for. That is often the case for us. The good news is we have copies of the book for sale over here, and I am certain that Stephanie will be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you all for being here. Come back next week for e-viewing and Ebony Lumumba. Help me thank Stephanie Rolph for this fabulous program today.